Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Monday, June 13th, 2022. Former Attorney General Bill Barr telling the House January 6th attack committee that he thought former President Donald Trump was becoming detached from reality by continuing to push baseless election fraud claims after the 2020 presidential election. Barr, just one of the former White House campaign and administration aides to Donald Trump, featured in today's hearing, focusing on how Trump was told repeatedly that he'd lost the election, but he claimed victory anyway. One witness who was to appear in person today, former campaign manager Donald Trump, Bill Stepien, had to back out because his wife was giving birth. The committee aired portions of his recorded deposition instead. Also today, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer promising to bring up for a vote the bipartisan deal to respond to recent mass shootings as soon as the legislative text is finalized. That deal between 10 Republican and 10 Democratic senators announced over the weekend. Attorney General Merrick Garland announcing charges against the man who illegally bought and sold nearly 100 guns, many of which were used in crimes. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken asked about the possibility North Korea will conduct another nuclear test. From the Associated Press, Donald Trump's closest campaign advisors, top government officials, and even his family were dismantling his false claims of 2020 election fraud ahead of January 6th, but the defeated president was becoming detached from reality and clinging to outlandish theories to stay in power, the committee investigating the Capitol attack was told Monday. The article goes on election night itself, Trump was growing increasingly unhappy and rejecting the results as they came in. Former campaign manager Bill Stepien said in testimony played before the House panel investigating the Capitol riot, son-in-law Jared Kushner tried to steer Trump away from attorney Rudy Giuliani and his far-flung theories of voter fraud that advisors believed were not true. Trump would have none of it. That from AP. Today's committee hearing included a montage of video from the depositions that the committee has conducted over the past year describing what happened election night. You're going to hear from former Trump campaign manager Bill Stepien, also former Trump advisor Jason Miller, and advisor Rudy Giuliani, also former White House advisors, and Ivanka Trump.
A few of us, myself, Jason Miller, Justin Clark, and Mark Meadows, gathered in a room off the map room to listen to whatever Rudy presumably wanted to say to the president.
Was there anyone in that conversation who, in your observation, had too much to drink?
Like Mayor Giuliani.
Tell me more about that. What was your observation about his potential intoxication during that discussion about what the president should say when he's addressed the nation on election night?
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated, but I do not know his level of intoxication when he spoke with the president, for example.
Were you part of any discussions with the people I mentioned, Mr. Stepien, Mr. Meadows, or anyone else, about whether the president should make any sort of speech on election night?
I mean, I spoke to the president. They may have been present, but President spoke to the president several times that night.
There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we'd won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
I remember saying that, to the best of my memory, I was saying that we should not go and declare victory until we had a better sense of the numbers.
Okay. Can you be more specific about that conversation, in particular what Mayor Giuliani said, your response, and then anybody else in the room's response?
I think effectively Mayor Giuliani was saying, we won it. They're stealing it from us. Where'd all the votes come from? We need to go say that we won. And essentially that anyone who didn't agree with that position was being weak.
What was your view at the time as to what he should or shouldn't say?
I don't know that I had a firm view. as to what he should say.
Ivanka Trump.
The results were still being counted. It was becoming clear that the race would not be called on election night.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this the next day or the next day whenever we had something to say.
And did anybody who was a part of that conversation disagree with your message?
Yes.
Who was that?
The president disagreed with that. I don't recall the particular words. He thought I was wrong. He told me so, and that they were going to go he was going to go in a different direction.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Part of a montage of clips played by the January 6th investigation committee. That last one was President Donald Trump on election night declaring victory. You also heard from former White House aides and campaign advisors Bill Stepien, Jason Miller. You heard Rudy Giuliani and also Ivanka Trump. One of the in-person witnesses today, Chris Stirewalt, former Fox News Channel political director, fired after that network election night that Joe Biden had won the state of Arizona, one of a half dozen close states that would determine the election winner. Former campaign manager Bill Stepien was to testify in person under subpoena, but a family emergency kept him away, his wife giving birth. His lawyer, Kevin Marino, speaking to reporters outside the committee room.
No, actually. Mr. Stepien was here in town with me preparing for his testimony in response to the subpoena. Got a call this morning at about 6 o'clock telling him that she had gone into labor and was advised to get to the hospital immediately. So we immediately advised the committee counsel, and he headed home to be with her.
Mr. Marino, is it Stepien's belief that the election was not stolen, that this was a big lie that Trump did actually push out?
Yeah, Mr. Stepien is and has always been known to be a very data-driven, serious, right down the middle, honest person, extremely well regarded for the quality of his work. He was always truthful with the president, and he was very clear with the president on election night that he did not think it was a good idea to announce a victory, that it was too early to make any determination, and that the wise course would be to just advise the public that they were proud of the campaign that they'd run, and let's wait to see what happens when all votes are counted. The president did not take that advice, but that certainly was the advice he was given.
And I understand he's now obviously continues to represent a number of candidates, some of whom have been pushing that election lie. Do you think that could be a conflict of interest, or is he advising those candidates who are seeking congressional office in particular that is maybe not the route to take?
The way Mr. Stepien always conducts himself is by following the numbers and being completely truthful and accurate about where they are. He's been very clear about his view as to what happened in the 2020 election, and you can rest assured that he isn't advising anyone to suggest anything to the contrary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Boy or girl?
Boy.
Congratulations to it.
Questions to Kevin Marino, lawyer for former Trump campaign manager Bill Stepien, in the hallway during a recess of today's House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Bill Stepien not able to be there in person because his wife giving birth to their son. More now from today's hearing. Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, Democrat from California, introducing portions of a video deposition of former Attorney General Bill Barr. Barr describing how he repeatedly told former President Trump there was no fraud in the 2020 presidential election sufficient to overturn the result of the Joe Biden victory.
Spurred by what he saw, Barr told the Associated Press on December 1st that there was no evidence of election fraud. And immediately after Attorney General Barr's statement went public, Mr. Trump berated and he nearly fired Barr. But Barr persisted in telling the president that there was no evidence to support the fraud claims.
This got under my skin, but I also felt it was time for me to say something. So I set up a lunch with the AP reporter, Mike Balsamo, and I told him at lunch, I made this statement that to date we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. I had a later meeting scheduled at the White House at 3 o'clock with Meadows. This was previously scheduled, so I knew this was going to come up, and I went over there and I told my secretary that I thought I would probably be fired and told not to go home. I mean, not to go back to my office. So I said, you might have to pack up for me. And so when I got over there, I met with the chief of staff. He said the president was angry. He didn't really get into the issue of the fraud. And then I went up to Pat Cipolloni's office and we were talking with each other. And word came down that he wanted us both to go to the Oval. And the president was as mad as I've ever seen him, and he was trying to control himself. And the president said, well, this is, killing me. You didn't have to say this. You must have said this because you hate Trump. You hate Trump. And then he raised the big vote dump, as he called it, in Detroit. And that, he said people saw boxes coming into the counting station at all hours of the morning and so forth. And I explained to him that at that point I knew the exact number of precincts in Detroit. I think it was 630 something. I said, Mr. President, there are 630 precincts in Detroit, and unlike elsewhere in the state, they centralized the counting process, so they're not counted in each precinct. They're moved to counting stations, and so the normal process would involve boxes coming in at all different hours. So there's nothing. And I said, did anyone point out to you, did all the people complaining about it point out to you, you actually did better in Detroit than you did last time? I mean, there's no indication of fraud in Detroit. And I told him that the stuff that his people were shoveling out to the public was bullshit. I mean, that the claims of fraud were bullshit. And, he was indignant about that. And I reiterated that they'd wasted a whole month on these claims on the Dominion voting machines, and they were idiotic claims. And I specifically raised the Dominion voting machines, which I found to be among the most disturbing allegations, disturbing in the sense that I saw absolutely zero basis for the allegations, but they were made in such a sensational way that they obviously were influencing a lot of people, members of the public, that there was this systemic corruption in the system and that their votes didn't count and that these machines controlled by somebody else were actually determining it, which was complete nonsense. And it was being laid out there. And I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time on that. And it was doing a grave disservice to the country.
Okay, so the very next day, the president released a video rehashing some of the very same claims that his chief law enforcement officer had told him were, quote, nonsense.
Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren.
Here's an example. This is Michigan. At 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in horror. We have a company that's very suspect. Its name is Dominion. With the turn of a dial or the change of a chip, you can press a button for Trump and the vote goes to Biden. What kind of a system is this?
Barr again told the president that there was nothing to these claims on December 14th.
When I walked in, sat down, he went off on a monologue saying that there was now definitive evidence involving fraud through the Dominion machines. And a report had been prepared by a very reputable cybersecurity firm, which he identified as Allied Security Operations Group, and he held up the report, and then he asked that a copy of it be made for me. And while a copy was being made, he said, this is absolute proof that the Dominion machines were rigged. The report means that I'm going to have a second term. And then he gave me a copy of the report. And as he talked more and more about it, I sat there flipping through the report and looking through it. And to be frank, it looked very amateurish to me. Didn't have the credentials of the people involved, but I didn't see any real qualifications. And the statements were made very conclusory, like, these machines were designed to, engage in fraud or something to that effect, but I didn't see any supporting information for it. And I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, lost contact with he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. On the other hand, when I went into this and would, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were. In my opinion then, and my opinion now, is that the election was not stolen by fraud. And I haven't seen anything since the election that changes my mind on that, including the 2000 Mules movie.
Former U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr, part of his video deposition to the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Portions of that deposition aired at today's hearing of the committee. There were also live witnesses. More on that from the Associated Press. They write the panel heard from noted Washington elections lawyer Benjamin Ginsburg, who discussed the norms of election campaign challenges, and former Philadelphia City Commissioner Al Schmidt, the only Republican on the city's election board, who told the panel that regardless of how fantastical some of the claims that Trump and his team were making, the city officials investigated. He discussed facing threats after Trump criticized him in a tweet. Also, the panel heard from former U.S. Attorney in Georgia, B.J. Pak. Here is Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, Democrat from California, asking about former President Trump's accusation of massive election fraud in Georgia.
Now, were you ever asked by Attorney General Barr to investigate claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election? And if so, what were those claims?
Thank you, Congressman Lofgren. Thank you for the question. Approximately December 4th, I believe, of 2020, Attorney General Barr and I had a conversation about an unrelated case to the case at issue. At the end of the conversation, Mr. Barr had asked me if I had seen a certain videotape that was being reported in the news where Mr. Giuliani, in a Senate subcommittee hearing that was held the day before, May 3rd, showed a videotape of a purportedly a security tape at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, which is also in Fulton County in the city of Atlanta. Yes. At the time, Mr. Barr asked me that he had made a public statement that he had not seen any widespread election fraud that would question the outcome of the election. And because of the videotape and the serious allegation that Mr. Giuliani was making with respect to the suitcase full of ballots purported in the video, he asked me to find out what I could about it, because he had envisioned that in some days after our call that he was going to go to the White House for a meeting, and then that issue might come up. He asked me to make it a priority to get to the bottom of, to try to substantiate the allegation made by Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you. I understand the Georgia Secretary of State's office investigated those State Farm Marina allegations and didn't find any evidence of fraud. What did you find when your office conducted its own investigation?
We found that the suitcase full of ballots, the alleged black suitcase that was being seen pulled from under the table, was actually an official lockbox where ballots were kept safe. We found out that there was a mistake in terms of a misunderstanding that they were done counting ballots or tallying ballots for the night, and the partisan watchers that was assigned by each of the respective parties were announced to send home. But once they realized the mistake, someone from the Secretary of State's office had indicated that, no, we're not done for the night. You need to go ahead and continue counting. So once they packed up the lockbox full of ballots, they brought back the official ballot box again and continued to tally the ballots from the lockbox. Unfortunately, during the Senate hearing, Mr. Giuliani only played a clip that showed them pulling out the official ballot box from under the table and referring to that as a smoking gun of a fraud in Fulton County. But in actuality, in review of the entire video, it showed that that was actually an official ballot box that was kept underneath the tables. And then we saw them pack up because of the announcement that they thought they were done for the night. And then once the announcement was made that you should continue counting, they brought the ballot box back out and they continued to count. The FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos that purportedly were double, triple counting of the ballots, and determined that nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false.
B.J. Pak, former U.S. Attorney, Northern District of Georgia, he resigned earlier this year, testifying today before the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol on Capitol Hill. The committee today also providing information about how former President Trump used election fraud claims to raise money. $250 million collected after the November 2020 election, most from small dollar donations from Americans, and saying the last email asking for cash went out a half hour before the attack on the Capitol started, January 6, 2021. Today's hearing was the second in a series of planned hearings by the committee. This from USA Today. Committee Chair Benny Thompson, Democrat from Mississippi, adjourned today's January 6th hearing after giving a glimpse of what is to come in future hearings, showing a video of January 6 protesters. Thompson said, "We know they were there because of Donald Trump." And one of the protesters in the video saying, "I know exactly what's going on right now, fake election. They think they're going to effing cheat us out of our vote." Another protester referred to the Dominion voting machine conspiracy theories often espoused by Trump, saying they can't really trust the software. That from USA Today. You can find today's hearing and the one before that, today was number 2, archived at our video library, cspan.org. Hearing number 3 from the House Select Committee is Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll have it live on C-SPAN Radio, C-SPAN Television, streamed at cspan.org, watch on the C-SPAN Now video app, or listen on your smart speaker. Say play C-SPAN Radio. This is Washington Today. From National Review, the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy on Monday expressed frustration after House Democrats declined his third request for unanimous consent to quickly advance a bill to increase security for Supreme Court justices. The article goes on, McCarthy has tried several times over the past week to advance the measure, which passed the Senate last month but has stalled in the Democrat-controlled House after authorities foiled an alleged assassination attempt against Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Here is the Minority Leader on the floor.
Mr. Speaker, you probably noticed as you came onto this Capitol of the intensity of force you see out in front of the Capitol. And is that because something is happening here today? No. Of an anticipation of a decision by the Supreme Court. Everybody in the country knows that there could be a decision, not knowing which way it would go, but the anticipation that people need protection, the Capitol. But at the same time that's happening, that you're protecting the Capitol, you're holding a bill to deny protection to those justices. It makes me wonder why. Why? Why, if 100 senators approve it, would it hold here for an entire month? Why, even after holding it for a month, somebody travels all the way across the country with one thing in mind: to kill a Supreme Court justice, gets arrested, and still the Speaker of the House will not move that bill, that the majority actually holds it, just so the country can understand. No one on this side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, objects to this bill. We agreed that we would agree to a unanimous consent. All somebody had to do was make the motion, and that could be on the president's desk. It could be signed, and they could be protected. But for some reason, Mr. Speaker, the Democrats on the other side of the aisle, even though 100 senators had agreed with this, everyone in your party on the Senate side said yes, you still say no. I do not understand that. I do not understand why we would risk that. I do not understand why you'll make sure the Capitol's protected right now, knowing that something could happen in the Senate this week, but you won't protect, or something that could happen in Supreme Court this week, that you won't protect those justices. Now, the Speaker came to the floor at a press conference last week, and she said, nobody, no one is in danger. How can you make that statement in the same week someone is arrested on your neighborhood trying to kill you? It makes no sense. And Mr. Speaker, if for some reason that we continue to come to the floor, that you feel some pressure on that bill, but you change it, the country will know why. Because if you change the bill and move it back to the Senate, you're trying to kill it. You're trying to delay it. That's exactly what you're doing.
Congressman Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, Republican from California, on the House floor today. The House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, did say last week that the House will vote on the Supreme Court security bill this week. She said the issue being worked on is whether to expand protections to Supreme Court clerks and staff. The Supreme Court, by the way, issuing a ruling today. New York Times writes the court ruled on Monday that a federal law does not require that immigrants detained for long periods while they are fighting deportation be granted hearings to decide whether they may be released on bond as their cases move forward. Washington Today continues in a minute.
C-SPAN has unfiltered coverage of the House January 6 committee hearings investigating the attack on the Capitol. Go to cspan.org/January6, our web resource page, to watch the latest videos of the hearings, briefings, and all of our coverage on the attack and subsequent investigation since January 6, 2021. We'll also have reaction from members of Congress and the White House, as well as journalists and authors talking about the investigation. Go to cspan.org/January6 for a fast and easy way to watch when you can't see it live.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which is available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. Senators today reacting to the weekend news of a bipartisan deal responding to the mass shootings in Buffalo, New York and Uvalde, Texas. New York Times puts it this way: the agreement put forth by 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats and endorsed by President Biden and top Democrats includes enhanced background checks to give authorities time to check the juvenile and mental health records of any prospective gun buyer under the age of 21, and a provision that would, for the first time, extend to dating partners a prohibition on domestic abusers having guns. It would also provide funding for states to enact so-called red flag laws and allow authorities to temporarily confiscate guns from people deemed to be dangerous, as well as money from mental health resources and to bolster safety and mental health services at schools. That from the New York Times. Here's the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor today.
For the first time in a long time, the Senate has a path forward on legislation that will save lives, reduce gun violence, and keep our communities safe. Make no mistake about it, we have a lot of work left to do before we actually pass a bill. But yesterday's announcement was a positive and necessary step in the right direction. Now comes the important work of turning this framework into legislation and legislative language that can pass Congress and be signed by the President. We must continue working with the urgency that this moment demands, because if we can save even one life from gun violence, it will well be worth it. Once the text of this agreement is finalized, and I hope it will be as soon as possible, I will put this bill on the floor quickly so the Senate can move quickly to make gun safety reform a reality. As I said, I will put this bill on the floor as soon as possible, once the text of the final agreement is finalized, so the Senate can act quickly to make gun safety reform a reality. So I urge my colleagues to continue working with the same good faith and urgency that has brought us to this point. Certainly, yesterday's agreement does not have everything Democrats wanted, but it nevertheless represents the most significant reform to gun safety laws that we have seen in decades. If enacted, this legislation will make it harder for mass shooters to access assault rifles by enhancing background checks for those under 21. It will prevent tragedies before they happen by helping states with their red flag laws. It will prevent gun violence at home by closing the so-called boyfriend loophole and establish new penalties for gun traffickers. And it will make our neighborhoods safer by investing in mental health and community violence intervention programs. The lion's share of gun violence happens outside the national spotlight, and these intervention programs are some of the most effective ways to reduce crime and make our communities safer. Altogether, this framework is a good and necessary first step towards changing the reality of gun violence in America. It will lay the foundation for future action. Most importantly, this legislation will go a long ways to saving lives.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor today. CNN has an article about this bipartisan agreement. It includes a section titled, "What Lawmakers Left Out." And they write, expanded background checks. That currently background checks are not required for gun sales and transfers by unlicensed and private sellers. A ban on assault weapons, and also higher minimum age for purchase of assault-style weapons from 18 to 21. Senator John Cornyn, Republican from Texas, is the lead Republican negotiator, and he spoke today on the Senate floor about the deal.
From the beginning, I promised my constituents that when I took an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States, I did not take that oath with the intention of violating it. And so I said at the outset I would not support any additional restrictions on the rights of law-abiding gun owners. There are hundreds of millions of guns in America today, and the vast majority, almost all of those gun owners are responsible. They're not a threat to public safety. And so this being a constitutional right to keep and bear arms, there is no basis to restrict the rights of law-abiding gun owners or to restrict the constitutional rights of any of our citizens. I made clear this is a red line of mine from the outset, and this bipartisan agreement on principles makes good on that commitment. The gun-related provisions in this proposal will only impact criminals and those adjudicated mentally ill. Law-abiding gun owners will not be subject to any new restrictions, period. Our agreement also strengthens the existing background check system, something we've had strong bipartisan support for and where we've had some notable successes in the past. For example, the Fix NICS bill after the tragic Sutherland Spring shooting, where an individual who should not have been able to get a firearm because of his record of felonies and domestic violence and mental health commitments was able to do so because the Air Force had not uploaded that information into the background check system. I'm proud of the fact on a bipartisan basis that we passed that legislation which compelled federal agencies to post this derogatory information, which disqualifies people under current law into the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Since 2018, when that bill was signed into law, there have been 11.5 million new records uploaded into the background check system. As I said, our agreement on the background check system in this particular legislation is an attempt to try to make sure that existing law works the way that Congress intended.
Senator John Cornyn, Republican from Texas, the lead Republican negotiator in reaching this bipartisan deal, announced on Sunday, speaking on the Senate floor. At the White House, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre getting questions from Associated Press White House reporter Darlene Superville.
Can you talk a little bit about what specifics the White House would like to see as the lawmakers sit down and try to turn this into a bill? Specifics on what you want regarding access to juvenile records, red flag laws, and redefining which gun sellers now have to do expanded background checks.
Well, as you know, the text is now going to be written, so we're going to allow the negotiators to go through that process. What we do believe and what the president has said is this is a historic agreement, and it's the most significant legislation that we have seen to reduce gun violence since more than 20 years. And so it's a bipartisan. The president is pleased to see this as a step forward. As we know, this is about saving lives. And so the president is going to wants to see Congress act. He wants to see this on his desk as quickly as possible, and that's going to be our focus as it relates to his involvement in any of this. His team continues to talk to Congress on a regular basis, as they have been this past several weeks, and we're going to continue talking to negotiators on the Hill, to congressional members and staff on the Hill, and we will continue to have those conversations. But the president wants to see this on his desk to sign as soon as possible.
Will the White House weigh in at all in terms of the final legislative language and text and specific things that the White House would like to see?
I don't have any specifics on any pieces of the legislation and our involvement there. What we will say is we want to see this move quickly. The president wants to see this move quickly. This is about saving lives, and we think, again, this is a step forward in getting that done. Legislating is, when you think about legislating, it's about negotiating. It's about getting to a place where both sides can come to an agreement, and this is a bipartisan handshake, a framework, as you all know, and we're pleased by that, and we want to get that done.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters in the White House briefing room. Politico adding this, negotiators have said they want the Senate to pass the package before the chamber leaves at the end of next week for the 2-week July 4th recess. That timeline is theoretically feasible if the text is finished by the end of this week. According to two people familiar with the deal, if writing the legislation takes longer, senators may have to wait until after the recess to move forward. It could take a week or longer for the full Senate to pass the bill once they have text, unless it earns support from all 100 senators. That from Politico. From the Dallas Morning News, as part of its crackdown on illegal gun trafficking, the Justice Department said Monday it caught a Dallas man who'd illegally bought and sold nearly 100 weapons, one of which was used in a Fort Worth area murder. Most came from a single dealer who lost his gun seller license last month. Well, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland making this announcement from the Justice Department in Washington.
Today, the Justice Department is announcing an indictment in the Northern District of Texas, charging an individual with illegally dealing in firearms. Law enforcement ultimately recovered those guns in multiple cities in Texas, in Baltimore, Maryland, and in Canada. The defendant was arrested last Friday, June 10th, and has been charged with 1 count of dealing in firearms without a license and 3 counts of making false statements during the purchase of a firearm. The indictment charges that the defendant purchased at least 92 firearms, primarily handguns, from federally licensed firearms dealers. It alleges that 75 of those firearms were purchased from a single dealer in the span of just 6 months. That dealer has relinquished its federal firearms license to ATF. The indictment also states that law enforcement recovered 16 of the firearms in incidents including homicide, aggravated assault, and drug trafficking. Almost all of those guns were recovered in incidents occurring within 1 year of purchase. At least one of those guns was recovered by law enforcement 7 days, just 1 week after it was bought. Data from ATF's National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, also called NIBIN, showed that the firearms the defendant allegedly purchased were linked to multiple shootings in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. One of the firearms originally purchased by the defendant was linked to 2 separate aggravated assaults and 1 incident of unlawfully carrying of a firearm. The indictment also charges that 3 separate times over a 3-month period last year, the defendant falsely stated to a federal firearms licensee that he was the actual transferee and buyer of the firearms, when in fact he was not. Those firearms included a Taurus 9mm pistol, a Glock 9mm pistol, and a Glock 40 caliber pistol. The investigation is ongoing.
U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland at the Justice Department in Washington. This is Washington Today. From Reuters, South Korean Defense Minister Lee Jong-sup said on Sunday that his country would enhance its defense capabilities and work closely with the United States and Japan to counter North Korea's nuclear and missile threat. The United States warned this month that North Korea is preparing to conduct a 7th nuclear test and says it will again push for United Nations sanctions if that happens. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken hosting the South Korean foreign minister today in Washington and asked about that possible nuclear test by North Korea.
We remain concerned about the prospects for what would be a 7th nuclear test over multiple administrations. We know that the North Koreans have done preparations for such a test. We are being extremely vigilant about that. We're in very close touch with our close allies and partners, starting with the Republic of Korea, also with Japan and others, to be able to respond quickly should the North Koreans proceed with such a test. I can say simply for today that we're preparing for all contingencies, again, in very close coordination with others, notably with the ROK and with Japan. And we are prepared to make both short and longer term adjustments to our military posture as appropriate. A nuclear test would be dangerous. It would be deeply destabilizing to the region. It would blatantly violate international law as set out in multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. So we urge the DPRK to refrain from further destabilizing activity. We call on the DPRK to engage in serious and sustained diplomacy. And indeed, in that regard, we are prepared, as we have been, to proceed with no preconditions. And as I said earlier, and I'll repeat now, we have no hostile intent toward the DPRK. But our efforts to engage without preconditions thus far have not been met with a response from the DPRK. In fact, the only response we've seen thus far has been this multiplicity of missile tests, including ICBMs.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the State Department in Washington, alongside the visiting South Korean foreign minister. President Biden signing into law today a bill that would create a commission to study the potential creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture, and also whether such a museum should be part of the Smithsonian Institution. We'll hear from the president in a moment from this White House ceremony, but joining him, Vice President Kamala Harris, whose mother immigrated from an Asian country, India.
The National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture will teach and tell the story of our country. This is a story about heroes who shaped our nation for the better. From the South Asian Americans who helped transform farming up and down the Pacific coast, to the Japanese Americans who defended our freedom during World War II, to the Chinese American garment workers who marched through the streets of New York City 40 years ago to win better pay and benefits for all workers. This is also a story about some of our country's darkest moments. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese Americans, the murder of Vincent Chen, discrimination against South Asian Americans after 9/11, and today's epidemic of hate, which is fueling violent acts against many communities, including the AA and NHPI community. Because you see, this is also American history. And we must teach it as it really happened, so that we can learn from our best moments and learn from our darkest moments, and in particular then, to ensure they are never repeated, our darkest moments.
Vice President Kamala Harris in the White House East Room. She was followed by President Biden.
While this bill was been working its way through the Congress the past decades, its story behind it goes back centuries. Throughout our history, beyond what the Vice President pointed out, Asian American, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders have literally shaped the history and the contours of this country. As I said last month, in Asian American History Month, a reception in the Rose Garden we had, there's no single Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander identity. The diversity of the cultures is significant, and the breadth of achievement is equally as broad and significant. The enrichment of our country has been our communities, not just the country, but down to individual communities, the impact that the community has had. All of it has been defined by who you are and who we are as a nation. And it's defined us. And all of it's an embodiment of so many of you here today.
President Biden at the White House before signing into law a bill recently passed by the House and Senate to study the creation of a National Museum of Asian Pacific American History and Culture. The 8-member commission would have 18 months to complete its study and make a recommendation to Congress. Axios reporting on this adds that the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in 2016 after a decades-long push led by the creation of a commission in 2001. Similar advocacy resulted in a 2008 law that formed a commission to study the establishment of a National Museum of American Latino, which remains in the works. On Wall Street, this from CNBC, the 2022 stock sell-off intensified on Monday, with the S&P 500 tumbling to a fresh low for the year and closing in bear market territory as recession fears grew ahead of this week's key Federal Reserve meeting. The S&P down 151, and NASDAQ down 530. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down 876. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. You can get more of Washington's top stories sent to you every day with C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word. Sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we're taking your calls, live, on the air, on the news of the day, and we'll discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Tuesday morning, a look at the ongoing January 6 hearings with syndicated columnist and the author of America's Expiration Date, Cal Thomas. Then the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend William Barber, talks about the group's upcoming Moral March on Washington on June 18th. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, text messages, and tweets.